We don't have anybody remote for this, right? You're all feeling very present. That is very gracious.
Is your email name? Yeah.
All right. So it looks like a few people are still wandering in, so I'll kind of make a slow start into this. So welcome to another session of science-based choices for climate action. The session that's about to begin is on cities and climate change. Welcome to the audience that's here in person. Welcome to our virtual audience. This has been an amazing day and a half so far, and we still have another day and a half yet to go. The conversations that are going on during breaks, over meals, has just been fabulous to engage with our students, with our speakers. It's been a very enjoyable time. I got another set of thank yous to do. So behind the scenes, thank you, Sumaya Kwayam, for everything you're doing. Lindsay Lyons, who's not so much behind the scenes, but is very much holding all the seams together. Thank you to, we've got about over a score of student volunteers doing various jobs and roles in this, and thanks to all of them, and thanks to Nico Haven, who usually is sitting over here, but isn't right now. Somewhere. Anyway, Nico, who's coordinating and keeping all our volunteers on task. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Ren Wei, who is our moderator for this session.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ren Wei, and I teach East Asian art, architecture, and design at Dickinson here. Welcome to the panel on cities and climate change. And I'm joined by three distinguished panelists on the subject, and we will discuss climate risks, adaptation, mitigation, resilience, and equity in cities. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. We have Debra Roberts here next to me, who is the head of Sustainable City and Resilient City Initiative Unit, Durban, South Africa, and the IPCC Working Group 2 co-author. Some of us had the pleasure of attending her keynote lecture yesterday on climate resilient development. Next, we have Karen Seto, Frederick C. Hickson Professor of Geography and Urbanization Science at Yale School of the Environment. She was a coordinating lead author for the IPCC 6th and 5th assessment reports, and some of you already heard her speak at yesterday's session on demystifying the work of IPCC. Then we have Timon McPhearson, Professor of Urban Ecology and Director of the Urban System Lab at the New School, and IPCC Working Group 2 author. So each of our speakers will first speak about 5 minutes, and then we're going to extend our conversation into a more interactive dialogue with the audience, both in person and on live stream. So with that, we'll begin our discussion.
Super. Who do you want to start?
Would you mind starting?
Fabulous. Thank you, Ren. And good afternoon, everyone. You've survived day 2 in this very chilly room. Your adaptive capacity is very, very good. So I work in the real world, and so you'll find that I tend to talk in stories because I think stories are the best way of communicating ideas and information. And I'm going to start off by telling you a story about the IPCC. So I joined the IPCC in the 5th assessment cycle because that was the cycle, and Karen told us about this yesterday, that really embraced the urban for the first time. So I think, Karen, you were the first coordinating lead author in Working Group 3 to head up an urban chapter, and we had one in Working Group 2. And we thought, well, this was really exciting in Working Group 2 that we had this urban chapter, and we would want to establish links with all the other chapters that were being written about in AR5. And so we would go out to the other chapters and say, hey, there's this urban chapter. Let's see if we can form some linkages in the narratives we give to policymakers in our assessment. Because cities impact pretty much everything in the world, and you'll see this as a key finding from Working Group 2. And I was sent off to a chapter that I won't name as the ambassador from the urban chapter to say, hey, I'm here from the urban chapter. Can we talk about the findings of your chapter in relation to the world's cities? And they kind of turned to me in a very puzzled way and say, but we do a global assessment. We can't even see cities in our assessment, which I felt was quite worrying given the fact that we're an urban species. So we've come a really long way in the IPCC. We've gone from being urban blind to having a 6 assessment cycle, which has really prioritized a focus on human settlements, urban, rural, the linkages between them. And probably the biggest move forward for us in the IPCC within the assessments, and this is a feature of both Working Group 2 and 3, is this recognition of system transitions that I spoke about yesterday, that the opportunity exists in the built environment and the infrastructural environment to transition us to a new path of development, which will allow us to tackle the climate change challenge, but also address developmental issues, put us on a path that is more sustainable. And what is important, I think, about those 5 system transitions is that cities in many ways provide the geography for all 5. If you're talking about energy, if you're talking about industry, if you're talking about society, the bulk of us live in the world's cities. And if you think about the impact that cities have on consumption and production chains, the impact on the natural ecosystems in the world. And again, Karen has written extensively about the growth of urban areas and the impact on biodiversity hotspots. So in many ways, cities provide us with a location of action that is significant. It's global scale. And that's an important part of the story that we can relate to policymakers. Because when we talk about these grand transitions, these big elements of transformations, let me tell you, it's very hard for my mayor to grasp what that means. And so I need to be able to tell stories of where that change is possible. And if you talk about cities, the majority of people will identify with cities, even if they don't live in a city. They know what a city is. They know the services that a city offers. They know the aspirations that a city brings. And so cities become not only a place of potential action, of delivering services, of development, of doing that in a climate resilient way, of doing it in a low carbon way, and meeting various development needs, but they provide us with an opportunity to do that at scale, which is really important. So it gives us a sense that we have agency that is big, that can turn the world around, that can allow us to deal with those problems. But not all cities are equal. It's a bit Orwellian in the sense that cities of the Global South are quite different. We've got the most rapid urbanization happening in the Global South currently. The bulk of global population growth will, in fact, be in the cities of the Global South, and our cities are quite different. So we do have the mega cities of the world, so things like Lagos. The majority of the cities where this growth is happening are small secondary cities, 1 1 million people, and that speaks to kind of skills and resources that they have access to and the kind of challenges that they will need to tackle in moving to this low-carbon, climate-resilient development path. Another major characteristic of those cities, which is called out in our assessment, is the high level of informality. So I come from a city, we have just under 600 informal settlements in our cities. And what do informal settlements tell us? This is where people vote with their feet. They're saying, this development path does not work for me, and therefore I'm going to do something different. And so that's a real challenge to the existing notion of urban development. And so when we think about the urban transition, I often worry that many of my colleagues think about trams running down a street. They think about green roofs on a building. But you've got to have streets to have a tram on it. You've got to have a building to have a green roof. And many of these things don't exist in the high levels of informality that exist in our cities. So if you go to Addis Ababa, for example, about 90% of Addis is informal. If you go to Dar es Salaam, about 70% of Dar is informal. And so these pose real challenges. And so the questions we have to be asking ourselves is, if cities offer us this large global scale transition and transformation in our society, if they are the places we can tell stories that people recognize, we need to think about what the transitions will be in these emerging cities of the world. What does that look like? What are the enabling conditions that allow those cities to get onto a different track? And I can tell you, as a local government practitioner of 30 years, I cannot tell you what the African city of the future should look like. We just have not invested enough time in developing that vision. It cannot be a Boston, it cannot be a Carlisle, it has to be something different. But what is that difference? We don't yet know, and I think that's our frustration. What our IPCC report does tell us, though, is that we need a series of enabling conditions to make those transitions possible. So things like finance, capacity building, technology. So those are all well known. We've known those for years. But importantly, our assessment points to the fact that equity and justice are as important as providing finance. The ability to get residents from those 600 informal settlements to the table in City Hall to talk to us about what their needs are, what level of services are adequate. You must remember, these are places where girl children are scared to go to the restrooms at night because the restrooms are external to houses, and walking from their house at night to those communal ablution blocks could mean that you get attacked or raped. So these are very real and different needs, and the question is, how do you take those challenges and turn that into a grand transformation? So equity and justice and inclusion are important, and really importantly, I think a message that emerged from our Working Group 2 report is that you cannot separate out climate change from development. We have to be prioritizing development in our discussion. So it's a very complex bag of opportunity and challenges, and I'm of the firm belief that unless we get the cities of Asia and Africa and South America to be on a new track that is context relevant, that allows everyone a say and a right to the city, we are simply not going to save the world. So I believe this is the most important panel, the one on cities. Over to you.
I love that. I agree, Debra. So Debra likes to start with stories. I'm going to start with quizzes. Very easy, okay? But everybody has to participate, all right? So I'm going to start off with a very simple quiz. It's true or false. Actually, no, just say true, okay? If you believe it's true, just raise your hand. This is a really easy one, all right? So you have to raise your hand if you think it's true. We are about as close to 2100 as we are to the end of World War II. True. Everyone's doing quick math in their head. It's true. We're at 2022. 2100 is about 80 years away. The end of World War II was about 80 years ago. True. I'm just say true. Okay? There's no true or false. Raise your hand if you think the following statement is true. About a quarter to a third of the countries that exist today did not exist at the end of World War II. Okay, true. Depending on how you define a country and how you define the end of World War II. So, over the last 80 years, we've experienced relative calm in terms of the climate system, relatively speaking. Of course, we've had more intensity and frequency of extreme weather events. But imagine what will happen in the next 80 years. And what will happen in terms of the new countries that will form, the countries that will collapse, the new cities that will form, and the new cities that will collapse, or the old cities that will collapse. Every single day for the next 30 plus years, every single day, an area that's equal to about 20,000 American football fields globally will become urban. They'll become paved. 20,000 American football fields every single day for the next 30 years. And guess what? Every 5 days, we're building a city of 1 million people. So think of the resources that are required to build those cities. All the concrete, steel, metal, not to mention the farmland and forests that will be paved over. So I have 3 points in terms of thinking about cities and climate change. The first point is we cannot solve climate change if cities don't transform themselves. That's very, very clear. And I mean the cities that exist now. I don't mean the cities that we're going to build, not the 20,000 American football fields that are getting converted and built. I mean the cities today, because the cities today that are already in existence, they contribute to somewhere between 65 to 72% of CO2 emissions. Okay, so the bulk of greenhouse gas emissions actually are being emitted, responsible from cities. So the flip side of that is there's an incredible opportunity because cities are pretty nimble in terms of policy, much more nimble than national policy makers, oftentimes. And cities are smaller in size, so policymakers at the urban scale or at the local scale can be more responsive to local constituents. So it's both an opportunity and a challenge. But the very first point that I'm making is that we're not going to solve climate change unless cities that currently exist undergo a major transformation. And we can have lots of discussions about what those transformations need to be. The second point is about the cities of tomorrow, those that are getting built or getting revitalized or rebuilt. Those cities need to avoid emissions. So the existing cities need to reduce their emissions, they need to decarbonize, they need to get to net zero. We had a whole panel yesterday on what net zero looks like. The good news is we actually have the technologies in place to get cities to net zero. It's really about financing and political will. But the second challenge is for all the cities that haven't been built, we need to make sure that they avoid emissions while increasing the well-being and the standard of living for literally billions of people who don't have, as Debra was just saying, they don't have clean water, they don't have roads, they don't have buildings. So for a lot of the cities that haven't been built, it isn't about minimizing their emissions, it is trying to find low emissions or net zero emissions pathways while they can actually develop their infrastructure. And again, the good news is we have the technology, it's about political will, and it's about financing, and it's about leapfrog development. The third point that I want to make is that cities solving climate is actually related to cities solving 2 other big crises. And one is around the biodiversity crisis. That's a whole other discussion, but clearly, if you imagine that we're paving over 20,000 American football fields every single day, a lot of that is taking place on fragile habitats that provide a lot of ecosystem services, and Debra's slides yesterday talked about the value of nature for our health. Not only can cities solve climate and biodiversity, the third crisis that they could actually solve is the gross inequities that exist both within cities, but increasingly between cities. There's a lot of research that is showing that inequalities are growing actually within a single city, but also between cities. And so it is critical that as existing cities pursue pathways to decarbonize, that they do so in ways that increase equity and well-being and improve the health of the people who live in them. So I'll end there and pass it over to Timon.
Thank you. You two are a hard act to follow, I have to say. I was going to pick up on a couple things from our cities chapter in Working Group 2, which was under Debra's leadership, really just to put out a few talking points that hopefully we can dig into a little bit more, and I think you'll see that some of them echo other points that have been made. But one of them is about urban development, and that the nature of urban development is concentrating people and infrastructure and economies in a way that create risk, right? The nature of the development pathways that we have, a very 20th century mode of development, actually creates risk. So I think this is one of our fundamental challenges. I think this is similar to the point that you're making, Karen, that we can't continue to develop in a 20th century mode that's car-centric, for example, for certain kinds of cities, or that uses technologies, designs, and construction that is really based on a 20th century climate. Or, as you said, that continues to pave over nature like it doesn't have critical value for our fundamental adaptation and for solving the biodiversity crisis. The opportunity space, though, is that, as you've shown with a lot of your work, cities are growing incredibly fast in certain areas of the world especially, and this growth gives us an opportunity. I think in all of these challenges, there's opportunity space for cities to be solutions for the climate crisis. And one of these is this global opportunity to really harness the nature of urban change as an opportunity for us to do that kind of new urban development. One that I don't think we've, as you said, fully defined what that even looks like. We just know it has to have a whole number of fundamental transformations. So this can take the form of inclusive planning, of everyday decision-making that really shifts that mode of development. But I think, and I'm going to make 5 quick points here. The first one really is that the way in which we've developed cities, largely on this 20th century model, creates risk on its own, completely separate from climate change. It creates vulnerabilities. The second point is that when you add climate change on top of that, then we have this exacerbation of those vulnerabilities and inequities that already exist in cities. And one of the key findings that came out of our assessment report, and the one that kind of worries me quite a bit for the near term, is that the next 10 to 20 years of climate change are already built into the climate system. So this means that substantial increases in urban impacts and risks in cities, many of those are going to be unavoidable due to the historical and already expected trends of greenhouse gas emissions. So all of that transformation that needs to happen to reduce emissions in cities is essential, but even the next 10 to 20 years are already built in. And this is critical because it means that adaptation has to happen, and it has to happen now if we're going to protect vulnerable populations in urban areas. Of course, there's positive news in this too. It means that we can reduce risks to multiple kinds of climate-driven extreme events: drought, wildfires, extreme heat, extreme precipitation, coastal flooding, and tropical storms. We can reduce those risks substantially by taking action on the mitigation side to lower the total warming, but only also by fundamentally strengthening the adaptation efforts within cities. And this can take many forms. It can take the forms of protecting and preserving nature, by improving planning and management in cities, and others. But both of those points, I think when you look at this exacerbation of climate change on top of existing vulnerabilities that created by the development patterns that persist within cities all around the world, means that we have this fact that we're all emphasizing, that it's the poor and most marginalized that are the most vulnerable, and they're most vulnerable in all cities. So you've mentioned a lot about the vulnerability in Global South. The thing that I've found kind of amazing in cities all around the world is that there are vulnerable populations in every city. It exists as a global phenomenon, right? In New York City, where I work and live, there's over 1 million people who are living below the poverty line or who are otherwise socially vulnerable, who also live below the 100-year floodplain. So on top of existing vulnerabilities, they're also facing inequitable risks from coastal flooding and storms. And this is in one of the wealthiest cities in the world. So the challenge of really addressing that vulnerability, I think, is huge. And it's why you're hearing this refrain of equity and justice and protection for the most vulnerable has to be central to every single kind of climate adaptation that we have. That's kind of my third point. My fourth point really is that adaptation then has to be as important as mitigation to solve the climate crisis. This is why IPCC has an entire working group devoted to adaptation, but adaptation has played a second fiddle to mitigation for decades now. If you look at climate finance, right, 10% of climate finance is on adaptation. That's a problem that we absolutely have to solve. So we can talk about system transformations, but we're going to have to actually talk about and find the levers of mechanisms in civil government and federal government and policies with the private sector to increase adaptation spending by 10 to 100 times to deal with both the current challenges we're already facing in cities, but the ones that are coming in the next 10 to 20 years, let alone further out into the next 80 years, as you've mentioned. Last night, Neil suggested that maybe adaptation was easier to get done than mitigation. But you pointed out last night, and I think this is clear from our report, we're so far away from where we need to be in terms of actually bringing adaptation to the fore to deal with the kinds of challenges that cities are already facing and the ones that we think they're going to continue to face. And it comes back to that first point I made, that concentration of people and infrastructure and economies in small places, relatively small land area-wise, means that's where we're seeing the largest impact of these climate-driven extreme events. And those are the places that really emphasize why cities have to be a fundamental part of the solution. The last point I want to make is that nature-based solutions is a fundamental opportunity that we have. This is starting to become mainstream in cities, that cities are really embracing nature as an ally, as an adaptation opportunity, a resilience opportunity. But again, here too, that mainstreaming is still a drop in the bucket of the real potential that we have. Part of it is not paving over more nature and finding a different development approach that isn't about concrete, which again is this fundamental pattern that we are still doing as part of urban development. But it's also really recognizing where the opportunity space there is. Again, I'll give you another sort of number. A recent report by the World Economic Forum looked at all urban infrastructure spending, and spending on nature-based solutions is 0.3% of urban infrastructure spending. So if we start thinking about, and this was true in the Chapter 6 of the Working Group 2 report, where we framed the need for adaptation around efforts on social infrastructure, natural infrastructure, and physical infrastructure. If the natural infrastructure is only 0.3%, then again, we have a long way to go. On the one hand, that's concerning. On the other hand, it shows there's deep opportunity in terms of how we can start to leverage nature as an ally in this, and in this way, think about how we can solve the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis together. So I'll leave it there. I think these are many things that we can dig into more deeply, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm going to abuse my role as moderator because I was just so fascinated by some of these common streams in your talk. Maybe we could discuss a bit more about the sort of the transformations that must happen in more detail. And also, I'm interested in this idea of when we think about cities, we often think about mega cities, and that comes to mind. But as Debra mentioned, there's so many small to medium-sized cities, right? And I'm thinking that maybe Karen was talking about how it's easier to work with policymaker on a smaller scale with cities versus a national level. So maybe some of these, talking about some of these, small, medium cities, which are actually, I think, the majority of the cities. And also I'm interested in the nature-based solutions in more detail, if possible. Yeah. Examples of, what are some of these, if minimal, more successful nature-based solutions, and what are some of the potentials there in the future for us?
Watch out, Timon just wrote a book on this.
I can pick up on that a little bit, but I'll hand it off to you guys. I think, and Debra, I'm interested to hear your perspective on this too, but because you brought this up last night, the role of urban agriculture, for example, as a kind of opportunity that can build food security. And one of the things we see in cities all around the world is that urban agriculture, community gardens, allotment gardens, spaces where people are getting together to grow food do more than provide food, right? They also provide social spaces and build social cohesion, which is really critical for building social resilience, right? And this is something that I think needs to be better understood when we think about the role that nature can have in adaptation, is that it has many roles. And that's a fundamental difference than gray infrastructure. On average, nature-based solutions is about 50% more cost-effective, but we're still not spending the money on it, and we don't even really know what its value is because it's providing mental health benefits and physical health benefits and food production, stormwater absorption, urban cooling, right? The list kind of goes on, even for individual allotment gardens or areas in and around outside homes. And this is true across the sort of urban gradient, right? In interior urban spaces, out into the peri-urban spaces where you sometimes have more space. So there's lots of examples we can point to, and they're going to be different in different contexts in terms of what works. And that's one thing I think we're still trying to understand. What's generalizable? What are some general principles that maybe can apply in lots of different contexts? And what really has to come bottom up, where local knowledge and indigenous knowledge is maybe the only way to really know what's going to work in a particular place. But what seems to be true is that nature has a job to do. It naturally does that job well for us if we can protect it and restore it and conserve it and integrate it as part of urban planning and design.
I can speak on the mitigation side, in terms of what cities need to do in terms of reducing their emissions. So we can think about all cities, every single type of city, whether you're a small or large, global north or global south, the kind of transformations that cities need to undertake fall into 3 buckets. And they need to do all 3 of these things simultaneously. First thing they need to do is reduce their demand for energy and materials. And there are many different pathways to doing that. One pathway could be improving energy efficiency, improving the energy efficiency of transport in cities, of buildings. It could be through urban design, through strategic densification, so that people live close to where they work, or they live near the destinations that they want to get to. So these destinations could be work, it could be school, it could be to a store, it could be to the gym, it could be to the park. It used to be that we designed cities so that destinations and origins, where people lived and where they wanted to go, were actually in close proximity. And it wasn't until the advent of the car that we started designing cities so that people lived here and where they wanted to go were there, and they were primarily connected through big highways. Lots of different strategies to reduce energy demand, but that has to be a very big bucket. The second big bucket of transformation that cities need to undertake is to switch energy supply. So you reduce what you demand, but what you do demand, you need to switch the supply. And there's a lot of literature that suggests that we need to electrify things, but not only do we need to electrify things, we need to make sure that the source of electricity comes from net zero energy sources. So it's not good if you're electrifying, let's say, your heating and your cooling, and let's say your car, you're using an EV, but if your electricity comes from a coal-fired power plant, right? So we need to electrify, transport, buildings, heating, cooling, and at the same time, make sure that the source of the electricity is net zero or very low carbon. The third big bucket, so switching energy, the third big bucket, and this is related to the nature-based solutions, is that cities need to increase carbon sequestration and storage. So I want to just emphasize it's both carbon sequestration, so it's using nature to absorb carbon from the atmosphere, but the other thing that cities can do is actually be stores of carbon. There's a lot of really exciting technology out there. Mass timber is one of them, where you can use mass timber, which stores carbon. So instead of using concrete, steel, and other materials, modern materials, you can use mass timber, which would actually store carbon. So cities could be stores of carbon pools. So those are the three big buckets, and I'm happy to talk more about those in detail, but those are the three big ones that every city needs to think about how they can make advances in all three of those simultaneously.
Yeah, so for me, particularly in terms of the work we did in Working Group 2, I think our Chapter 6 sort of highlights some of the complexities of making these ideas real in the world's cities, because this is not a linear progression from carbon-intensive at-risk cities mysteriously being transformed into low-carbon, low-risk cities. And we've got to think about the mix that allows us to take the journey from one to the other. The first mix is, and very often, and I'm an extremely strong proponent of ecosystem-based adaptation. In fact, the city I come from is well known for work in that area. But I think often people think, well, that means we give up on the grey infrastructure. Suddenly we mysteriously turn all infrastructure from grey into green. And I think one of the important reality checks of our chapter was, no, you've actually got to use those things together. There's still the role of grey infrastructure in the city, and that makes it even more complex. If it was just a one in, one out, that would be easier. But the question is, how do you achieve these new mixes between grey and green? And that poses institutional questions. Anyone who's had to deal with a city engineer knows that they are wedded to concrete. They love it. It is their calling in the world. And so beginning to have that institutional debate about how we create these new mixes, how we use these different forms of infrastructure together, talks about the need to build new capacity at the city level to understand how these mixes operate, to get engineers to green up their skills. And that's a tough job. Having done that myself, I know it's a tough job. It also points to some of these challenges we've indicated. Very often actions will have co-benefits, but then there are trade-offs, and both Working Group 2 and 3 speak to the fact that decisions are complex things and they will lead to trade-offs. So again, nature-based solutions, absolutely fabulous. Karen's just spoken to you about using urban planning as a really important way, for example, to improve energy efficiency within the design of the world's cities. And very often that means densification, so that your transport systems are backed up by an adequate number of people to make them economically viable. And the moment you concentrate people in buildings, nature tends to get squeezed out. So how do we get the mix between incorporating nature in our cities, but still getting the economies of scale that allow us to use these approaches such as public transport that allow us to reduce our carbon footprint? And that's a real challenge. So the city I come from is located in one of the world's 32-odd biodiversity hotspots. And our ecosystems need space. They really need substantial space to be viable. So how do you get substantial space for these very important biodiversity-rich ecosystems in the middle of the city while still getting public transport and an adequate number of people to back that? So I think these are some of the tough decisions we've got to take. We also highlight, very importantly in our Working Group 2 report, both in the urban chapter but throughout in our summary chapters, that many of these decisions are going to be linked to governance and institutions. So these changes are going to be driven by government, and Chapter 6 calls out particularly the importance of local government as an agent for change in making some of these transitions and transformations possible. But if we look at the institutional position of local government in many places in the world, they do not have the power or the resources to affect these changes, particularly in very centralized countries. So if you look to many countries in Africa, you'll get a situation where a national government, and this is an actual example from Tanzania, where the national government appointed an Italian consultancy to draw up the master plan for Dar es Salaam. So the plan for Dar es Salaam was produced in Italy. It did not involve the local government officials in Dar. In that process. And so the power of local government is really important. And we've got to question that. For many years before I became a climate change negotiator, I went to the COPs. And it always befuddled me because I came from local government. So government to me means something. But I'd stand in line to register along with the indigenous peoples and the farmers and the academics because we're not recognized as government in the international negotiations But the science is telling us it's a whole of society approach. There's this global scale opportunity at the local through the city, but the level of government or the sphere of government that's responsible for those cities doesn't sit at the table in the climate change negotiations. So let's not lose sight of governance and institutions. And here I just want to raise a flag. You know, those local governments will need science that's relevant at the local level. And the IPCC, so that panel of 195 governments, has decided that it will do a special report on cities in the 7th assessment cycle. Now, this is a phenomenal change for the IPCC because it will have to localize its assessment for the first time. So I think this is a new challenge for the scientists that will be involved. I think it's a timely one because if we can get out that special report at the beginning of the cycle, cities offer us that scale for agency and the conduit for the movement of finance that nothing else offers us in the century. And if we've got 8 years, this is an important moment to pick up on the challenge that indicated for us, that the IPCC can produce a special report timelessly in AR7 that targets a level where we can actually get action at scale. So I think this is an important level of momentum that the IPCC can generate and contribute to the global debate.
Great. We're now going to take some questions from both the audience in person and also from the virtual audience. We have 2 mic runners, so you please wait until you have the mic to speak.
Hello, my name is Aaliyah, and I'm from Newark, New Jersey. Hopefully, you guys understand that Newark and Newark are the same thing. But my question, I'm a farmer in there, and I've seen a lot of what Newark goes through and the struggles as a city, just trying to get the resources and stuff like that. Just this past summer, we had a really bad drought where a lot of the Newark residents didn't have water, and on my farm, we couldn't water any of the crops, and a lot of our crops did die. But Newark is just facing a whole lot of issues, such as the water crisis. Phil Murphy is planning on building a power plant right in the center of Newark. There's a lot of trash dumping that happens there, and a lot of like Black-owned stores are being replaced by things such as Starbucks. And so you guys made a point in saying like we should upgrade the buildings, the streets, the environment, but my thought goes straight to those things lead up to higher property values and higher things of that sort. Past the point to where the current population that lives there can't afford to live there anymore. And so my question basically is, how do you upgrade these like buildings and streets and these resources and stuff like that to like, how do you basically push a city to be more sustainable without giving the threat of gentrification or even colonialism?
Yes, we'll take a couple together.
I had a more general question. If you would be able to elaborate on sort of the implementation of public transportation, especially in countries like the U.S., where cars are such a vital part of our culture, especially, I mean, even here in Carlisle, you know, the Walmart you can walk to, but, you know, it's preferable to drive there. The other grocery stores you have to drive to, Rite Aid, you know, CVS. So how do you implement these solutions with public transportation where cars are so vital to everyday life?
This is more of a basic question, but I'm just curious about what you mean by, I'd like you to go more in depth about these nature-based opportunities or solutions. I know you mentioned community gardens, but what might be some more examples of this like natural infrastructure that we could use?
You want to take more?
Thanks. Energy follows a law of diminishing returns. As a society increases their energy consumption, their HDI, Happy Planet Index, however it is you want to measure human well-being, increases. After a certain threshold, that human development index doesn't increase as much as you increase your energy consumption. So this is kind of a question for Karen specifically. You talked about reducing demand for energy. Two-part, is there a BTU per capita of energy consumption where that threshold is crossed? Do we need to lower to a certain level of BTU per capita? And then the follow-up, how do you talk about this in a Western society, more Western developed society, which has such high emphasis on overall energy consumption? The United States is off the charts in terms of its energy consumption, but we attribute that to human development. We need to reduce that. How do you still have that high level of human development while still reducing energy? Thanks.
Following that, I would also like to add a question, similar question from our virtual audience, which is
I love it.
what is a realistic timeline to reduce energy demand and switch energy supplies in cities?
Can we pause?
Pause.
Yeah. Does anyone want to start on anything?
I'll take the easy question. I think that's relatively easy. Yeah. So, is there a BTU per person? There's actually a huge literature on this, and it's very clear that we as Americans consume much more energy per capita than we need to have the same standard of living. So if we look at per capita energy use and compare it to other countries with very similar HDI, so and not just HDI, there's other metrics that we can use, so not just the Human Development Index, it could be well-being, it could be health, et cetera. We are literally off the charts, okay? So we could scale it back significantly. The absolute number of BTUs per capita, I don't have that off the top of my head, but it's, again, an order of magnitude lower. But even if we look within the US, there's a huge variation. And not surprisingly, it's related to the question about transport. It's very related to the way in which we plan and lay out our cities. So if we look at a city like, let's say, in cities in the West primarily that are low density, Houston comes to mind as one, Los Angeles comes to mind as another. Compare those cities to the Chicagos, the New Yorks, the Bostons that are much more walkable and accessible. There's, even within country, a very, very large variation. So the scientific evidence is clear that we can have a very high standard of living and scale back our per capita energy use. And I think that it's also time that we have a discussion about sufficiency. What do we need versus what do we want? I have a 15-year-old son. I always like to mention him. I have a 15-year-old son, and, there's no limit to what he wants. There's no limit to what we want as humans, but there are limits to what we need. And I think that's just another way for us to think about that.
I'm going to take the hard question.
Oh, good.
Up here. Because the answer is not, it's easy to say the answer, it's not easy to do the answer, and this gets to some of the complexities that Debra was bringing up, and the kinds of trade-offs that happen when you try to implement a particular strategy, but you actually need to implement multiple strategies simultaneously, right? So providing, for example, well-performing, beautiful, high-functioning nature in areas of the city can raise real estate values and can cause displacement, right? So we're not going to be able to do that and solve the problems of gentrification without coupling it simultaneously with rent controls, rent stabilization, additional affordable housing. These have to be part of the same set of strategies, not one strategy over here gets implemented and then we see there's a problem and then we're going to have to try to figure out how to fix it. And I think that's true all across the world, that in cities we have to implement multiple strategies together. They have to be coordinated, and we have to better understand the potential kinds of trade-offs or unintended consequences that might happen, because there is research on this. We've seen this happen. There's already plenty of examples that should tell us how to do it better. But then it challenges our governance models, because it means we have to have agencies that work together, so that the housing agency and the parks department and the Department of Transportation, right, that all of these agencies are developing strategies that are aligned to meet the needs of the vulnerable communities or the communities that have the most need for multiple services, not just climate adaptation, right? So I think the answer in some senses is very simple. We have to do all of it, and we have to do it together in a coordinated way to protect and provide increased livability and access to basic services in those places. And there are ways to do this, right? If we're going to develop new housing or commercial opportunities, it's to make sure the job creation happens in those neighborhoods and isn't, for example, people that are coming outside. That way you can create more job security in the process and more wealth security. We can do that by also utilizing the fact that in the US context, somewhere between 10 to 20%, average 15% of all land in cities is vacant. So there's tons of opportunity to invest in both low-income housing and affordable housing and also nature-based solutions and other things together in these kinds of spaces, even in dense urban areas. In the densest city in the United States, there's 15,000 vacant lots. So there's a clash between what they should be used for, but my point really is that we have to couple these strategies, and it's easy to say, and it's more difficult to do because our governance situation, the way in which we actually plan and create these strategies aren't necessarily coordinated that way, and that's something that's going to have to change. So I think this requires a bottom-up push from communities advocating for these things, and also recognition within city government that they're going to have to create the mechanisms for that to be able to happen.
Maybe let me build on that, because I think there's an additional challenge to the gentrification issue. I mean, certainly all the comments that Timon made indicates that there is a functioning government in place that can provide that integration. And I go back to the fact that in the Global South, in many cases, that does not exist. And so there's a real challenge around the world, not only to tackle the technical aspects, so achieving equity through appropriate town planning regulations, which allow an adequate mix of land uses and different types of communities to emerge because of the way the plans are discussed and agreed to at a community level. But in many cases, particularly where we've got high levels of informality, that kind of government doesn't exist. And so that's almost a bigger challenge, because those urban areas then are entirely at risk of people who have resources and can make decisions outside of formal government. So I think we've got a real focus, or need to focus very strongly on strengthening that local level of governance to allow the kind of integrated, inclusive planning that Timon was speaking about to be effected, and not only to have a plan be drawn up, but to ensure it's implemented and that there's adequate monitoring that plan is given effect to in the real world. Because very often a plan drawn up in City Hall bears no relationship to what appears on the ground, and so you need the ability to ensure compliance. So I think there's a whole value system of governance that we need to be mindful of. Just in terms of the question around examples around nature-based solutions, so just giving you one from my practical experience, so taking off my IPCC hat for a moment. One we've used in our city is we've taken it's an 800-meter buffer around our landfill site. So we've got a big regional landfill site, and we've got a buffer that was required around it from an air quality point of view that was old sugarcane land. And what we've done is effectively worked with the local peri-urban and rural community in that area to rebuild a forest. And that's important in that area because it means that in terms of protecting that catchment, we can reduce the flooding in that catchment. Also, if there's any spill of leachate from that landfill site, even though we have leachate ponds, we've got adequate protection. We've used that to recreate one of the most impacted ecosystems that we have, which is one of the woodland ecosystems in our city. But it's also provided socioeconomic opportunities for that local community. So they've been involved in collecting the seed, growing the plants, and they get issued credit notes for those trees, and they can then use those credit notes to exchange for things like paying school fees, for getting their driver's license, for getting building materials to build houses, and so on. So you create a full value chain, and I think that's the important part of nature-based solutions, is it can't only involve nature. there must be a people element, there must be a people benefit from that approach. And so I think it's thinking systemically about those relationships that's important. On the transportation one and the love for cars, I come from South Africa, and we adore our cars. And so I suppose we're much like the US in that regard. I mean, transportation isn't my thing, but working with our transport department, certainly the provision of reliable and safe alternatives, public transport, is a necessary first step. But again, that's not easy. If I look at that process in my city, because of apartheid, the vast majority had to find their own ways to be transported around the country. And so we've got a very vibrant taxi industry who is very protective of their roots. And so they're not so keen on public transport. And so there's been very strong governance challenges in having that negotiation. So again, I come back to the government's area. But we've got to make public transport sexy. Go to Europe. You know, the high flyers get on their bicycles. That's what you do. That's, you know, the kind of trending thing. And I think that's the important thing, is we need a behavioral change. We need some of the iconic members in our society to pick up on these changes and make them popular, you know, become influencers for this kind of change. But it's not going to be easy to get many societies out of cars, which is why we need to start working now. And we can tie that with regulation. So things like congestion charges. Go to Singapore. I mean, they're absolutely brutal about when you can use your car and when you can't. And that is enforced very heavily. The same with the charges in London. So it's a combination of behavioral changes, I think, making options available that are accessible and safe, and regulation. So, you know, I don't know if you have any other views on that, Timon, Karen? Because I'm not a transport person. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to add to the transport, and I want to add to it. Yeah, absolutely, we need to have the behavior change. And in order to do that, I mean, part of the challenge right now in many cities is that where people want to go is very far from where they live, right? And so you have to get there by way of a car. And in order to have people take public transport, we absolutely need to have people close to the places they want to go. So you could do this one of two ways. You either bring stores, coffee shops, parks close to where people live. And we've seen again and again communities vote against that. They lobby against having more stores near where they live. Or you bring housing close to where stores are. And that tends to be a much more effective strategy in many communities, is to build housing near where there are already stores and shops. And interestingly enough, in many communities where they've done that, the property values around these stores tend to increase, and then it enables people to then use alternative forms of transportation. I have another quiz, just because I like quizzes so much. True or false? Raise your hand if you think this is true. The area covered by corn is the largest crop in the US. If you think that's true, raise your hand. Stumped you. It's lawns. Lawns are the largest crop if lawns were a single crop. Interestingly enough, in survey after survey, the two things that people say they don't like to do is be stuck in traffic and mow their lawn. And one way to get around both of those issues is by building housing that is smaller in scale and don't involve lawns. So I'm originally from Hong Kong. We immigrated to the US in 1974. And my parents bought a starter home that was 1,400 square feet. Nowadays, the average size of a new home start is well over 2,800 square feet. It's very difficult to find a starter home that's 1,400 square feet. So, in fact, building smaller units closer to stores would actually help solve a climate crisis, but actually would help solve a health crisis because we're in our cars too much, leading to a lot of health issues. But it would actually also solve a housing crisis and an equity crisis.
Can I make one quick point? Because a lot of what we're talking about is new forms of urban development. And many of these things we've been talking about will have positive climate impacts if they're all implemented, especially in terms of less carbon emissions. If we start thinking about like getting people closer so they don't have to drive as far, or maybe they don't even have to drive. But adapting cities to the climate challenges we're facing is not the same thing as a lot of what we've been talking about. And you've talked about building local capacity, local government capacity. There's also a finance capacity that I think is really critical if we're going to think about how these new infrastructures can be financed and can be built in a way that are climate adapted. And cities are probably not going to be able to do this on their own. And retrofitting cities, because you mentioned this in your opening comments, that a lot of what we need to do is fix the cities we already have. That's a very expensive prospect. And for many cities, it means they're going to need federal resources. So there's a coordination that is going to have to happen between city governance and federal governance in terms of getting on the same page about what's needed. Just trying, and I'm sure going back to Newark, solving problems of, say, extreme precipitation in particular areas that are low-lying, just trying to figure out how to solve that in New York City is at least a $100 billion infrastructure problem to solve, and the city can't. Even though we said, like, it just can't afford that. And there's so many other problems. So just trying to bring up that there's some other levels of coordination that's not just local governance capacity, it's really trying to think about where to finance for adaptation is going to come from and how do we mobilize that and direct it in a way that, again, protects the most vulnerable communities as the starting point.
I just want to comment that not all strategies are very expensive, right? So on the mitigation side, taking a lane that is currently dedicated to a car and making a bike lane requires a can of paint. You can get fancy and go like Copenhagen and have elevated bike lanes, but literally a can of paint. And you can paint a street lane and say, this is no longer for cars, this is for bikes or for walking. Planting trees is relatively cheaper. So there are a lot of low-cost strategies, and I think the one question that we haven't answered is, how quickly can we get this done? And I think it's important to think about various spatial scales or various scales at which this can be done. I mean, cities ultimately are comprised of every single one of us in this room. It's comprised of individuals, households, streets, neighborhoods, districts, et cetera. And so think about the decisions that you can make on an individual level to reduce your energy demand. Think of what you can do on a household level. Those are all at the urban scale. They're just at smaller scales. Now, I also don't think that the onus should be completely on us as individuals. There are things that we need that are more structural, that, for example, changing the energy grid, right? I mean, that's something that we're not going to do. We need governance, we need finance to do that. But I would argue that one of the big changes, I think, in this assessment report is really changing the focus from only about supply, about changing the energy system, about changing cars and buildings, and focusing back on us and how much we are demanding, how much we're consuming. Do we need to eat so much X, whatever X is? Do we need to be driving as much as we do? And again, I just urge us to think about sufficiency.
Well, on the note of sufficiency, please join us. Please join me in thanking our speakers today.
Thank you for an excellent discussion. I teach a course on sustainable and resilient communities, and I now have the recording of this session. I now have another piece of material to use in my teaching, so thank you for that. On the issue of individual choice, so for the young folks in the audience, oftentimes students will talk about what can I do individually, and they'll be talking about doing things like I'm going to recycle, I'm going to compost, wonderful, great things to do. Shortly in your lives, a big decision you're going to make that's really important is, where will you live? Where will that place be relative to where you will work, where you will shop, where you will play? Make that choice very carefully. And then following up on Karen's point about, well, the choice set isn't always what we would like. Zoning laws are a big part of why those 2,700 square foot homes are the norm. You can go to zoning board hearings in Carlisle or wherever you wind up living. Show up, have your voice heard, change the choice set for yourself and others. With that, we'll end this session. The next session begins at 4:15. We're going to do a little bragging in that session. It's about some of the things that Dickinson has done in order to get to zero net emissions. So I hope you'll forgive us doing a little bit of bragging about some of the things we've done. I hope you'll join us for that. Thank you.
Okay, got you. You'd rather be here.